Yes, thank you, Mr. Joffrey. Excuse me, and thank you, everybody, for joining me this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. It's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you. Excuse me, I'm going to go to my first slide here, but not spend much time on it since this was covered by Mr. Joffrey already. The one thing I will highlight is you can see here our web address for HBX, which is Harvard Business School's online education division. I'm not going to talk a lot about HBX today. In fact, I'm not going to talk any about HBX today, but I do encourage you to check out our website where you can learn about the sorts of programs we offer online, which allow you to kind of get Harvard Business School case method learning in various disciplines without ever having to fly to Boston. So please check that out if you get the chance. So as you all know, we're going to talk about how to lead in a rapidly changing world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a personal story to demonstrate how quickly the world can change. Here you see a picture of my great-grandmother. She doesn't look very happy. I often point out that probably people born in 1897 weren't very happy. It was a much tougher world to live in than the one we live in now. It's pretty amazing when you think that she was born in 1897, which means she was 6 years old when the Wright brothers first flew. And when the Wright brothers flew, they got to an altitude of approximately 3 meters and flew at about 10 kilometers an hour. So I'm going to use aviation as kind of a touchstone for us to show how rapidly the world changes, and related again to a personal story. So when she was born in Minnesota in the United States, you see a map of the US there on the left, she went by wagon to Texas, a distance of about 1,500 kilometers. For those in the Middle East, it's about the same distance from Madinah to Baghdad. And obviously, she did that it was very dangerous and it was very slow. If you were lucky, you were probably going 4 to 5 kilometers a day, maybe 6 via wagon and train, and you were doing it at a time when there were a lot of hostile threats in the center of the U.S. In 1914 and 1918, right before World War I, she married my great-grandfather, who you see in this photo here. And in World War I, aviation's taken another relatively big leap. You see the Sopwith Camel aircraft there. That's an airplane that could fly at about 3,000 meters altitude and about 181 kilometers an hour. So pretty significant jump in technology from 1903, just about 10 years before. Then we jump forward to my grandfather. You see here on the left-hand side, he was a air crew member in B-17 bombers, which you see here in the Pacific during World War II. And those aircraft now already are getting to altitudes approaching 7,600 meters and traveling nearly 500 kilometers an hour. An enormous leap from where we were, and just about 35 years after the Wright brothers flew. By the way, you see my grandfather in the top left of this image. He is fishing in a wheelchair. He wasn't wounded in the war, but at the very end of the war, he volunteered to evacuate polio patients out of the Pacific Theater and contracted polio himself and spent the rest of his life in his wheelchair. Didn't keep him from trying to get out and fish every now and then, though. Then here's my father. My father on the left there is in Vietnam and flew F-4 Phantoms. You see those jets, the representation of that jet on the bottom there in the Vietnam War. And the F-4 could go at speeds that people couldn't imagine when the Wright brothers flew. You get to about 2,400 kilometers an hour and 600 times the speed of my great-grandmother's wagon train. And you could also get to about 12,000 meters in altitude. And this is only about 57 years after the Wright brothers flew. And perhaps even more amazing, and many people don't think about this, but in 1969, men walked on the moon, and that was only 66 years after the Wright brothers first flew. If you just sit for a minute and absorb that, it's really a staggering feat of engineering, and one that likely will not be surpassed anytime soon. Even if we go to another planet someday, it will be done over decades of accumulated knowledge and research. Aviation moved incredibly, incredibly fast. And then here's where the story gets very interesting, is my father then, in 1978, was selected to be one of the very first group of space shuttle astronauts. In fact, it was the first group of space shuttle astronauts. You see on the left, on the right, a picture of the class of astronauts that were picked with him that included many American firsts. First African-American in space, first woman in space, American woman in space, first Asian American in space. Pretty interesting and diverse group of people. And then fast forwarding here in 1984, my father flew on his very first space shuttle mission on the first flight of the Space Shuttle Discovery, and spent 6 days in orbit. You see a picture of him there on the lower right in space. And on the left is my great-grandmother. You see the image of her I showed you at the very beginning of the presentation. She lived to stand on a beach in Florida, a woman who was born 6 years before the Wright Brothers first flew, to see her grandson fly into space on the space shuttle all in one lifetime. And that, to me, when people think about technological advances, they often don't think about aviation in a story like this, but it's an amazing, amazing advance in a very short amount of time. And the space shuttle travels at about 8 kilometers per second, getting around the world every 90 minutes at altitudes, say, of 350 to 500 kilometers. So a very, very different speed and altitude regime than what the Wright brothers did. And if you chart out the technology curve for aviation, forgive me, I've been using metric units, and this is in English units, but the point is still the same. As you tend to see, as you do in many technological advances, a hockey stick graph that shows a rapid acceleration in knowledge and advancements in a given discipline. And aviation was no different. And what's really interesting is that in the New York Times newspaper, about 2 weeks before the Wright brothers flew, and after the unsuccessful attempts of many more famous people to fly, the reporters there in their editorial section said that it would probably be it would take between 1 and 10 million years of effort before human beings were ever able to fly. And this was just 2 weeks before the Wright brothers actually did it. And it calls to mind a great famous quote by Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist, was that prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. So if we can't predict the future, then how do we successfully lead through it? And it's an important question to ask, and I think this cartoon tells us why. You see here the graphs behind them showing their profits and sales are plummeting, and somebody's asking, what if we don't change at all and something magical just happens? This falls in the category of hope is not a strategy. But if you can't predict the future, how do you plan for what you're going to do? And I'm going to talk about 3 broad areas that I think can help managers and leaders do a much better job of leading successfully when there's uncertainty. First, I think it's very important to look for data that tells a story. I'm going to spend time on each of these 3 topics, obviously discussing them. But it's important to know that data in the wrong culture can be deadly, literally and figuratively. We experiment and learn quickly, but we really need to make sure we listen when the experiments tell us something that we don't want to hear or don't expect. And we need to create cultures where ideas can come from anywhere and be embraced, but without groupthink happening. So let's first talk about data. You need to find a way, you need to find and use data that tells a story, but don't let something called the normalization of deviancy bite you. And I'm going to explain what the normalization of deviancy is. And I'm going to do it by going back to aviation and space travel. So here you see a picture of the space shuttle launching into space. And many people are familiar. You'll see the aircraft-looking vehicle, which is the shuttle or the orbiter. There's the big orange tank in the middle. That's just a fuel tank called the external tank. And then there's 2 solid rockets on either side that burn during the initial phases of launch. Now, these rockets are quite large. They're 45 and a half meters long. And what's interesting is they're made in Utah, in the center west of the United States, but the launch happens in Florida. So you have to get those boosters from Utah to Florida, a distance of 3,900 kilometers. The question is, how do you get something so large across that distance? Well, you don't. You have to break them into pieces. And in fact, here you see an image of a segment of a solid rocket booster on a rail car making its way from Utah to Florida. Now, given that there's segments, you obviously now have to bolt those segments together. And in fact, that's what they did with space shuttle solid rocket boosters. Here you see those, one of those boosters being put together at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And I want to get a little technical here because it's important for the point I'm going to make about normalization of deviancy. So here you see a top segment being joined to a bottom segment. Let me see if I can see my cursor here. Here's the top segment, bottom segment. The way they connect together is there's something called a tang, which is just a piece of metal, a rigid piece of metal. And there's a clevis, which is basically a slot. And so this tang fits into this slot. What you see here is the rocket fuel. This is actually solid rocket fuel. You see a cavity down the middle because the way it's ignited is a little small rocket, actually at the top of the solid rocket booster, fires down the middle of this, ignites the fuel, and the fuel burns from the inside out. Now, what's interesting, even if you're not an engineer, and I'm not, you can see a natural weakness in this design, which is you have this gap between the fuels, and fire and heat can start migrating along this path between the two solid rocket segments and creep out to the edge of the solid rocket booster. And again, you don't have to be an engineer to know that that's probably a bad thing if it breaches the outside of the booster. Here's an image of a cross-section of the side of the booster. In fact, this is a pin that joins sections together, and those pins would go along in these openings you see all the way around the circumference of the solid rocket. Here's the tang, which fits into the clevis. And to prevent gases from leaking out, there were two O-rings that were put. They were redundant O-rings put. And this is the famous O-rings that those of you who are old enough to remember the Challenger explosion. These are the O-rings that failed and caused that loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger. And I called it an explosion. It really wasn't. We'll talk about that in a minute. In any case, these primary and secondary O-rings are around the whole circumference of the solid rocket booster. They have the same diameter. The booster itself about 3.7 meters. So what happened when Challenger launched is there was a failure of the O-ring, and you actually see the failure here right at launch. Gas immediately escaped and vaporized the O-ring. That's what this black puff of smoke is. And in fact, after about 70 seconds of the launch had transpired, you started to see a pretty significant amount of fire escaping the solid rocket booster, weakening a joint that attached the booster to the external tank, which caused the thing to separate and lose aerodynamic stability. And it wasn't really an explosion. The space shuttle actually tore apart as that solid rocket booster bottom anchor came loose. So a lot of people call this the Challenger accident, and an accident is defined as an unfortunate incident that happens unexpectedly and unintentionally. This was not that. And this gets to the point about normalization of deviance and data. So let me explain. We knew that the O-rings on those solid rocket boosters were failing. And the reason we knew is because solid rocket boosters were meant to be reused. And here you see one parachuting back to Earth. It would burn for 2 minutes, be jettisoned from the external tank and parachute back into the Atlantic Ocean. They'd be towed back to Cape Canaveral and be inspected before being refurbished and used again. Here is a chart that shows damage to O-rings. The vertical axis here shows number of incidents. Remember, there's multiple O-rings on a solid rocket booster. So this is referring to 1 O-ring damage, 2 O-ring damage, 3 O-rings damaged. And each of these red dots is a mission that happened before Challenger. And you see they were happening as early as the second space shuttle mission, STS-2, in 1981. It happened on 41D, which was my father's first mission. They had severe damage to one of their O-rings. So you see there was significant damage happening in what's called the field joint, or the O-ring, where the two pieces of the booster came together. So this data indicated there was a problem and nobody seemed to notice, right? Well, no, that's not true. Somebody did notice. This man noticed. His name is Roger Bougielet, and he was an engineer at Morton Thiokol. You see him here with a model of the joint and the O-rings. So he had seen this data and he got very concerned, and he wrote a memo. And here you see the actual memo, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I am going to read these quotations off to the right that you can see. He said to his management, "This letter is written to ensure that you're fully aware of the seriousness of the O-ring erosion problem." He said the matter is urgent as a result of the SRM-16A nozzle joint erosion. SRM-16A is just referring to a recent mission, which eroded a secondary O-ring with the primary O-ring never even sealing. He says further in the memo, if the same scenario should occur in a field joint, and it could, then it is a jump ball, meaning it's uncertain as to the success or failure of the joint. The result would be catastrophic of the highest order, a loss of human life. And then he concludes the memo saying, "It is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action to dedicate a team to solve the problem, with the field joint having the #1 priority, that we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight along with all the launch pad facilities." So he had actually predicted the failure would occur on the launch pad. The shuttle would blow up on the launch pad and take out all the ground facilities as well. So he was exactly right about all of this, with the exception of the timing of the failure of the joint. And he wrote this 6 months before Challenger was lost. And there were other memos that were written even before this saying, everybody, look, we need to pay attention to this. Yet NASA didn't. And the question is why? And the reason is because schedule cost pressures and tests that kind of tell you what you want to hear cause harm that lead to what Diane Vaughn, who's a doctor at Columbia University, calls the normalization of deviance. And that's defined as a gradual process where unacceptable practices or standards become acceptable. And effectively, as deviant behavior is repeated without bad things happening, it becomes a social norm for the organization. This is a memo that, or a document that's written while the shuttle was being designed very early in its phases. This revision was in 1982, where before there were the pressures of schedule, before the launches were happening in a big way, people had sat down and said, you know what, let's think of all the ways something bad could happen in this very complex flying machine. And it was actually identified even at that point. This is in 1982. It was called a category 1, a criticality 1 item, meaning it could be catastrophic if there was a failure. And the memo is very clear about if you have leakage at this O-ring and you have a failure, it could cause loss of mission, loss of vehicle, and loss of the crew. So despite all of that, and despite it being a criticality 1 item, NASA management decided to explain it away. Since nothing bad happened, as I said before, in the past, nothing bad will happen in the future. This is an example of data from the past being used or not being used in an appropriate way to make decisions about the future. And it's so important to stay away from a culture where deviancy is accepted. And how do you do that? Well, one is you really need to be proactive and emphasize to others in your organization that when you put up guardrails, when there's little pressure, like that last document I showed you that showed criticality of 1, that was done when there was not as much pressure on the organization. They need to commit that if we're making these decisions and putting up these guardrails around normal behavior, normal results, while there's not a lot of pressure on, when the pressure is on, we're going to make sure that we go back to what we said when we didn't have pressure staring us in the face, and commit to staying the course based on what we thought then, because when you're under pressure, human beings can make bad decisions. You also need to develop a culture where data is not manipulated so as to avoid the normalization of deviance. And I think it's really important to frequently share examples from outside your company of data being used to justify mistakes. And 2 great examples of this, different examples of it, are Johnson & Johnson, a US pharmaceutical company. Several decades ago, somebody poisoned bottles of a pain reliever, Tylenol, and Johnson & Johnson didn't even think twice, even though it was likely most bottles were perfectly safe, probably 99.9% of them. They pulled every bit of product from the shelves, took a huge hit to their earnings and revenue, and in long term, though, they were viewed incredibly well for having done this, because they had a culture established that said our customers' safety is the #1 thing for us. And you can contrast that with Volkswagen recently. Many may be familiar with the emissions scandal, where they were rigging data and instruments to show that their cars had lower emissions than they actually did. And if you research that a bit, you'll find there was a culture there where it was kind of predictable that something like this could happen. So next we're going to talk about if you have an understanding of data and how to use it, you have a culture where it's used in the right way. You still have, it tells you a lot about the past, and we'll talk about more about that in a minute, but it doesn't tell you much about the future. And really the only way in today's world to make yourself successful in the future is to be able to run contained experiments that tell you if paths you might take are going to work for you. And you really want to learn quickly. You want to succeed or fail fast, and you want to implement the findings. Whatever you learn, you want to use the information to run your organization better. Let me give an example of this from a US retailer. So JCPenney department stores is a very large American retailer. It was larger in the past than it is now. It's founded in 1902, so been around for a very long time. At its peak, it had over 2,000 stores in 1973. You see here, though, like a lot of retailers, its stock price was taking a hit with the advent of technologies that allowed people to shop online. This is in 2005. You see it started about $50 a share. Their stock price went up to about $85 a share in 2007. But then between 2007 and 2011, you had about a 60% drop in stock price. So JCPenney thought, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this problem? Where do we find talent that can help us fix this problem? And so they went out and hired a guy named Ron Johnson, who had a successful career in retail for another large department retailer in the United States. But more recently, before joining JCPenney, he had been the guy who was in charge of Apple's retail strategy. And many of us forget, you know, when Apple came out with their retail stores around the world, there were a lot of people who said this was the dumbest idea ever. First of all, you're a technology company who's had great success selling through the web. Secondly, there were many technology retail outfits that were going out of business all over the world, both large ones and small ones. Yet in the face of those two things, Apple and Ron Johnson decided we're going to open retail stores, and it was a huge success. I think most of you, at least in most of the stores I ever have been to, both overseas and here, it seems like they're always jammed with people. And in fact, their sales per square foot in the last decade have been quite high relative to most retailers. And in fact, when Ron Johnson was hired, here's you see about the time he was hired is off to the far left here, and there was an initial bump. But then things went poorly in 2000. Oops, I'm sorry, I think I went the wrong way. Let me go to this chart. Here's where Ron Johnson was hired. Here's the bump in the stock. In 2012, it peaks out here, and then it drops some more. And by the way, the scales are different on this chart and the other one, so don't let that deceive you. But it was another 66% drop after Ron Johnson was hired. So what went wrong? There's a great article about this in the Harvard Business Review called The Discipline of Business Experimentation by a colleague of mine at Harvard named Stephen Tomke and a colleague of his named Jim Manzi. And really what went wrong can be summed up by this quotation, and in red here I'll just highlight is the problem is that big data can provide clues only about past behaviors of customer and not about how they will react to bold changes. And Ron Johnson enacted some really bold changes, which in and of themselves is not a bad thing, but he did them across all stores immediately. He did not test in markets to determine whether his ideas might work. What did he do? Well, he did a lot of things, but here's some of the big ones. He completely changed the pricing structure, confusing their most loyal customers. And one thing they couldn't afford to do was lose those customers who were still loyal to them. He did away with store brands. They had their own brand that they would sell in their stores that was apparel brand, and just decided to go with national and international brands. The problem with that is that it left them undifferentiated from many of their competitors. And he created stores within stores, and it raised the cost of doing selling, but didn't raise sales. As Bill Ackman, one of the activist investors, said that it was a big mistake was he was doing too much change too quickly without adequate testing on what the impact would be. And indeed, this is a mistake many companies make. So running controlled experiments before you roll out something in a bigger way is absolutely critical. Here's a great framework, and I'm stealing liberally from the article I referenced earlier. As I said, it's a very good one if you want more details on these things. But if you're going to do experimentation, there's several things you need to do. One is you need to determine it has a clear purpose. You need to make sure stakeholders are committed to abide by the results of the experiment. You need to make sure it's doable, and you need to ensure reliable results, and you've gotten the most value out of the experiment. And in short, this isn't that complicated. You need to think like a scientist and use a scientific method. Well, what's a scientific method? You need a hypothesis and about what it is you're going to experiment around. And it can't be fuzzy. It needs to be something that can be defined by an independent variable and a dependent variable. And these are very mathematical terms, but they're really quite simple. The independent variable, many of you probably know, is the thing that's the cause of a change, and the dependent variable is the thing that is affected by changing the independent variable. So as an example, I'll use another retailer. They had a hypothesis that they could reduce their operating costs by shortening store hours, and they could do that without affecting their sales. Obviously, a concern if you're retailers, if you shorten your hours, you'll have fewer sales. So the independent variable here is the hours of operation. We're going to manipulate the hours of operation and see if it affects sales. And in fact, in this experiment, they found that shortening their store hours did not materially impact their sales, but the experiment was rolled out at a few stores in markets that they think represented their demographics of their customer. It wasn't rolled out to all the stores at the same time. Finding ways to run these controlled experiments is a great way to get comfort that you're making a right decision for the future when there's a lot of uncertainty. You need to have a commitment to abide by the results. Using the same retailer again, it's called Kohls. They had an idea of selling furniture in their department stores. Most of their history had been smaller household goods and apparel. The management was exceptionally excited about this. They had reason to believe it could significantly increase their financial results. So they ran an experiment in several of their stores. So it turned out their hypothesis was wrong, that when they introduced furniture into stores, the stores that had the furniture had decreases in sales. It turns out that customers didn't really latch on to buying furniture from department store, from a department store of their kind, and the furniture eats up a lot of square footage that could be used to sell higher margin and faster moving inventory. And they learned the lesson, and to their credit, even though management was very high on this idea, they pulled the plug on it after spending money to test it because they realized it was going to be a disaster if they rolled it out more fully. I like to think of it this way. Most drug companies will never think of this. If you were a drug company, you said, our hypothesis is that our drug will reduce the risk of amputations in diabetic patients. And then you do testing, and the testing shows that the drug actually increases the incidence of amputation in diabetics. Then you wouldn't say, well, let's release the drug anyway, even though experiment tells us it's not working because our gut tells us it should work. Most drug companies never do this. Most companies that make airliners would never do this, because if they do it, they're going to go out of business very quickly. Yet many organizations in other industries do exactly this. They run an experiment, it gives them results, and they say to themselves, yeah, those results are great, but we really feel like it'll work, and they do it anyway. And many people have been burned by that before. So make sure if you're going to run an experiment, you have a commitment to abide by the results. You need to ensure the experiment's doable. And what that means really is it's very hard often to isolate all the causes and effects in an experiment. As an example, let's assume a human resources organization and a company in a high-rise wanted to increase the health of its employees by encouraging them to take stairs rather than lifts. And they find that a week after they run their campaign, the use of lifts has been reduced by 60%. A lot of people in the HR department might be patting themselves on the back saying, wow, we really did a great job of encouraging people to use the stairs. But what if I told you that during the week they implemented their campaign, that 2/3 of the lifts were out of service for maintenance? Well, obviously that calls into question the results of your experiment. This is a very simple example of something that's admittedly hard to do when you're doing it in a larger economy with many variables that can affect the outcome of an experiment. But you at least ought to spend the time to try and think through things that might give you a false positive or a false negative, as we'd say in an experiment, and isolate those. And really, if you think they've affected the experiment, try and find a way to experiment again where you can make that factor not be as important to the results. And then the last area we're going to talk about is ideas, and that they can come from anywhere, but you need to have a culture that allows you to nurture them and to have them blossom. And I'm going to actually go back to the space theme here again with a story that's very fascinating in a moment. But let's start here first. Where do good ideas come from, or where do ideas, let's forget whether they're good ideas, where do ideas come from? And I've used some of the research and writing of a guy named Stephen Johnson, who's written a book called Where Do Good Ideas Come From? And one thing that he says is that it's a myth that most ideas come from a eureka moment, that they're out of the blue and unexpected. So think of the story of Sir Isaac Newton sitting under a tree and having an apple fall on his head and deciding that there must be something called gravity. That story is likely untrue, and first of all, and secondly, that in fact, having that sort of epiphany is a very rare thing, if it happens really at all. That really ideas are the result of networks. The results of networks literally in your brain. As you get new ideas, your brain forms new connections. So you're getting neural networks in your head that are forming. But there are also networks among people, and this is probably the more important point, is that people nurture each other's ideas. So let me go to an example that demonstrates this very well, an example that Mr. Johnson has in his book that I think is great. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite called Sputnik, and you see a small image of it here. It was basically just a ball with some antennae coming off of it. And that Sputnik emitted a radio signal, and the reason it did, it was a beeping signal that could be tuned in from a receiver on the ground. The reason it did that was the Russians at the time were very concerned that most of the world would not believe they had really succeeded in launching an artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. So one way to prove the doubters wrong was to have that satellite emit a signal that people could easily tune in and listen to. And in fact, at Johns Hopkins University here in the United States, at the Applied Physics Laboratory, two guys named William Geer and George Weifenbach, you see them on the left and right here, ran to their radio equipment as being scientific nerds and wanting to hear the satellite, and tuned in their receivers to listen to the satellite. So it was putting out a 20 megahertz tone, And Gear and Weifenbach, as I said, asked themselves, well, I wonder if we can listen to it. And sure enough, they could. They tuned it in, and they were calling their colleagues into their office. They were talking with their colleagues about this at their cafeteria in the physics laboratory at Johns Hopkins. And their colleagues said, hey, if you can listen to it, maybe we can figure out how fast it's going. And the reason they thought they might be able to do that is because of something called Doppler Shift, which many of you may be familiar with. We're all familiar with it in kind of normal life when we're standing on a street and we hear the siren of an emergency vehicle, or we hear the horn of a car while it's coming at us. The pitch of the sound goes up as the car races toward us, and it goes down as it races away from us. And that's because the frequency of the sound waves gets compressed, so the sound sounds higher pitch when it's coming to you, and it gets elongated as the vehicle's going away from you, which makes it the pitch go down. And the same was true for Sputnik. As it was orbiting the Earth, it would be coming at your antenna for some part of its orbit, and they could measure the shift in the frequency of the signal being emitted by the satellite as it crossed overhead. And from that, they could determine the speed of it. And then with some more math, they said, can we figure out what the altitude of the satellite is? And sure enough, they could. They were able to calculate pretty precisely that it was at about 578 kilometers altitude. Then they said, well, if we use some really major new computing power, this is a Univac computer back in the 50s, one of the first computers, and I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that all the power you see here, you probably have in your phone in your pocket. They were able to use the Univac computer to calculate very precisely the entire orbit of Sputnik, all its parameters. And the big question then became from their boss, who asked them, wait a minute, if you can determine where a satellite is from where you are on Earth, can you reverse the process and determine your location on Earth relative to satellites? And they didn't know it at the time, but this was an important question for the US government, because they just developed submarine-based missiles. And this is a Polaris missile you see here in a test being launched from a submarine. One of the problems with launching a missile from a submarine, as opposed to a land base, is you don't know where the submarine is going to be when you launch it. Yet it's very important to know where it is for the guidance system of the rocket, because it's hard to hit a location on the ground if you don't know where you're starting from. And Gear and Weifenbach didn't realize that's why their boss was asking, but he had the secret information about the US government developing this missile and trying to solve this problem of how you could guide it from a moving launch point. And so that led, you can probably see where this is going, to the advent of GPS. And effectively, GPS works the same way, but in reverse, that Gear and Weifenbach used to calculate the orbital mechanics of Sputnik. If you have 3 satellites, you can know at any given time where you are on a sphere that radiates out from those satellites because of the signal they put out. You know the distance from this satellite on the sphere. You know, imagine these circles, by the way, are spheres, not just two-dimensional circles. You know where you are relative to the satellite on its sphere, the radio signal, and where you're on this one. Where they all intersect, that can determine very precisely where you are on Earth. And it's something we don't think about a lot today, but GPS, that came out of these the work of these men, has really changed the way we do everything in our lives, from navigation to finding a store where we might want to buy something, to finding our friends. It really is pretty amazing. And it all started, getting back to my original point, with an idea being nurtured by networks created between people. If Gear and Weifenbach had kind of sat in their office and said, well, this is interesting, but nobody else is going to care, then this may never have happened. But they were in an organization that had a culture where sharing what you were learning with your colleagues down the way was very important, and it led to incremental discovery after discovery that ultimately led to the GPS that we know today. And it's pretty amazing when you think about it. So one thing to ask yourself is, in your organization, do good ideas and feedback bubble to the top if you're the manager or leader? And often they don't. This is another great article on this very topic called Can Your Employees Really Speak Freely? By James Dedert and Ethan Buras from the Harvard Business Review. And they say there are 2 major reasons that people don't speak up. One is the fear factor. They are worried that they'll be persecuted if they raise an issue or come up with an idea that seems unorthodox. And the other is the futility factor, that it doesn't matter if I say anything, even if I feel comfortable saying it, nothing's ever going to change. Nobody's going to act on my feedback or idea. But really, the biggest issue, I think, is this, is as a manager, are you perceived as being too personally vested in an idea? So this was highlighted in an experiment that was done by some researchers where they asked people to imagine that they were on a multifunctional team developing a new product. And the project keeps hitting major technical problems, and the consensus on the team is to kill the project before it becomes, as I say here in quotes, a disaster. If you ask people if they're willing to raise their hand and say we should kill the project, a large number of them will. But if you add this other piece of information to some of the people and you say, by the way, one additional piece of info, your boss has invested a lot of time in the project. The researchers found that people who were giving that additional piece of information were much less likely to recommend killing the project. So this is all on us as leaders and managers, is that if we sound like we're too vested in an idea, it can be a real killer when it comes to people speaking freely about the value of that idea. So it's really, really important to foster a culture where people feel comfortable talking to you openly about these sort of things. So how do you ensure that the employees speak up and ideas get considered? There's a list of about 7 things here I think are really helpful. And again, I'm using liberally the information from the Harvard Business Review article and the research those 2 faculty members have done. One is to make feedback a regular, casual exchange. It's a lot easier for people to feel comfortable talking to you about something if you have exchanges with them regularly versus, say, every year during a performance appraisal. You need to be transparent. You need to be willing to open up about what you're thinking about and the concerns you have and about your own ideas. If you don't do that, then those that work for you will not. You need to reach out, and this seems like a very simple one, but many people don't. You need to ask people, how are things going? Do you have any ideas that have been ruminating in your mind? Do you have any concerns about the way things are going? If you ask the question, you'll be surprised at how often subordinates will answer. You need to soften your power cues. You see a picture here that's a little dramatic, and in some cultures, some of this stuff wouldn't be done anyway. But the point is still important, and it's a really interesting one. See, in the U.S., while I wouldn't put my feet on my desk, I might sit like this with my hands behind my head when I'm talking to somebody who works for me. And I think that often I would consider that to be a way to put them at ease, that I'm not being too formal, that I'm happy to hear their commentary on the way things are going. But researchers have actually found that this is considered a power pose. You're making yourself bigger, and it intimidates those who might work for you, and they're less likely to communicate openly with you, as do these other positions with hands on hips or leaning over a table with your palms on the table. Doing those things makes people less likely to share ideas with you or to give feedback to you. It's really important to avoid sending mixed messages. If you ask for feedback, you need to make sure, and I'm going to get to this in a moment, that you act on it. If you aren't open and honest with your own bosses and your employees see that, they're not going to be inclined to be open and honest with you. So it's really important to be consistent in how you think about openness and transparency. And this gets to this point, is to be the example. If you want people to be open, you need to be open with them. And lastly, you need to close the loop. I alluded to this already. There's a lot of folks will come forward to you with thoughts, concerns, new initiatives, and there may be very good reasons not to do them. I'm not suggesting that every employee's idea needs to be enacted or acted upon. But if you're not going to act on it, you need to make sure you tell the employee that and you give a reason why. And it simply could be, we don't have the time or resources. It's a great idea, we just don't have the time and resources. But not saying that and just leaving it open makes people much less likely to share ideas later on in their careers. And let me finish going back to another space theme here with an example of how ideas can come from anywhere if you have the right culture. So this is a close-up going back to where we started of the shuttle disaster. And I mentioned that it really wasn't an explosion, that really the vehicle kind of tore apart. And in fact, when they looked at photographs after the loss of Challenger, they could see pieces of it here. Here's the left wing. Here's the main engines on the space shuttle, the 3 engines on the back of it that are still burning. They probably still have some fuel in the lines. And most interesting for our purposes here is here's the crew cabin, which separated from the whole conflagration intact and did not lose its pressure, which sadly means the crew was likely alive and didn't die until they actually hit the water many minutes later. And that's a horrible thing to think about. And NASA was really bothered by this and thought that we need to find a way to offer a crew escape system for astronauts so that they at least have a shot of surviving something like this. Now, most engineers who work in aviation, when they think about crew escape systems, think of something like this. This is an ejection seat, an actual footage here of an F-18 aircraft crashing and the pilot getting out just in the nick of time. So Most people's experience, as I said, engineers who try to solve escape problems, they're used to solving it with rockets on a chair. The shuttle, this wasn't practical. While some of the early missions had ejection seats for the top, the two people who were on the space shuttle, to do its mission, it needed to have more than 2 people on it, and having more people on it meant ejection seats were just not a feasible option. So really what they were left with was the idea of, is there a way we can at least get astronauts the opportunity to open the side hatch of the shuttle, jump out, and parachute to safety? That might work. The problem is that if you jump out of the shuttle while it's in flight, you're going to hit the wing and be killed. So you still have the problem of, how do we get the astronauts clear of the wing if they're going to use the side hatch to get out? And by the way, the shuttle's very large. It doesn't look it in photos, but it's the size of a moderately sized airliner. You can fit a school bus, a US-sized school bus, in the cargo bay of the space shuttle, so it's quite large. So those engineers who were used to solving problems with ejection seats decided to solve the problem in a similar way of getting astronauts clear of the wing. Here you see a test where they have a mock-up of the side hatch of the shuttle. And here, believe it or not, is a rocket being shot outside of the hatch. And it's attached to lines, harnesses, which are then attached to the astronaut. And this isn't a real person here. It's a dummy, a mannequin. But you can see the sequence of photographs as the quote-unquote astronaut, here's a helmet, and here's the flight suit, the body, being yanked out of the side of the shuttle. Here's a better picture of the body, and then here you see the dummy parachuting down to Earth. Now, when a lot of people saw this, they thought this is a horrible idea. First of all, it just doesn't look like a lot of fun. Secondly, nobody was really enthusiastic about the idea that inside the cabin of the space shuttle, you would have rockets with rocket fuel that would be used to shoot you out the side of the shuttle. That just sounds very dangerous. And it sounds dangerous because it is dangerous. Again, you don't have to be an engineer to think that just doesn't sound like a good idea. But it was the only one they could come up with, until during one of the final design reviews for this design, somebody in the room who was not an aerospace engineer, and in fact was a medical doctor, was scratching his head saying, wait, what problem are we trying to solve? And he had the engineers explain to him that you need to get the astronaut clear of the wing if they were going to jump out the side hatch. And he said, well, what about just a pole? Why don't you just have a pole that sticks out and they can slide down it? And everybody in the room went, holy cow, that is a great idea. And they abandoned the idea of a rocket and instead just had a pole which compresses into the side of the shuttle, into the inside of the shuttle. And if there's ever an emergency, they just pull a handle. It has springs in it that shoot the pole out, and an astronaut would attach themselves to it and slide down the pole to parachute to safety underneath the wing. This is a great example of a culture where an idea that came from somebody who wasn't an expert bubbled to the top and solved a problem that nobody else was able to solve. If you have a culture like that, you're doing things right. So let's wrap up here before we take questions with the takeaways. I've mentioned that you really need to look for data, but avoid the normalization of deviancy. Don't let data tell you what you want it to tell you. Let it tell you what's actually true. You need to experiment. Don't roll out big changes all at once. Find ways to run very short and contained experiments that tell you something about the way the world's going to react to your idea. And you need to create a culture where ideas can flourish and recognize the importance of networks. If you don't allow free communication to happen among your employees, among your team, it's likely that good ideas are not going to bubble to the top and be adopted and help you succeed beyond where you are today. So with that, I'll end with my contact information. If you have any thoughts or questions at some point beyond this webinar, feel free to reach out to me and I'll get back to you. Just give me a little time because I get a lot of email. So with that, I will turn it back to Mr. Joffrey for any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mullane, for a very, very intriguing presentation. And folks, we are now open for question and answer. So if you have any questions, you could either insert it in the question chat box, or you could equally raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon available on your webinar console. So please click on it if you want to have an audio conversation. Let me go to the question box. We already have the first one from Ms. Ayana Contardo. The question is, hello, Patrick. Thanks for this opportunity to interact, and thank you for this precious content. The question, if Branson is investing in KSA, Kingdom Saudi Arabia, for satellites, do you see USA and China on a race?
Could you repeat the question, please? The first part was about Branson investing in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, you said?
Kingdom Saudi Arabia for satellites. Do you see United States and China on a race?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. You know, in talking with my father about the future of space exploration and having been in the space business myself, I think there will be a race, but I don't think often that has a bad connotation to it that I don't think it should. I think it's healthy when nations are competing with each other to develop technologies that I think are going to be good for all of humankind. And certainly not all technologies are, but a lot are. And I think that you know, I'm very enthusiastic about the idea that the Chinese, the Indians, Japanese, and others are trying to find ways to bolster their national pride by developing technologies that allow them to get to the moon or get to Mars. And investments like in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with respect to satellites, I think is a great thing. Yes, I think it will probably lead to races, but I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. It can be, but I'm hopeful that it won't be in this instance.
All right, thank you very much. And we have another one. Can you give us some of the examples of normalization of deviance in the business world?
Sure. So there are a couple of others that come to mind beyond, you know, the Challenger example I gave. One is the horrible Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico here near the U.S., which was a pretty big environmental catastrophe, and it also led to the loss of life of people. If you look into that that event, you will find that there were a lot of signals leading up to the explosion and loss of life and the spilling of oil into the ocean. So that's a great example, and perhaps an even more pronounced one for most of us is the global economic crisis of 2011, partly to a great degree triggered by what was happening here in the United States with mortgage lenders lending money to people they just had no business lending to. It was made most famous by the book and ultimately a movie called The Big Short, both of which I recommend if you haven't read them or seen the movie. But they do a good job of explaining how there were all sorts of signals that were, if anybody cared to look, that were going to tell the world where all of this free money, quote, you know, so to speak, was going to end up, that it was going to end up in a near collapse of the financial system. But people were making money and were starting to believe their own hype and really didn't step back and say, wait a minute, something seems off here. And what's unfortunate about that in particular is it's a recurring cycle. It's partly just human nature that it's evidence in global financial markets over and over again that we seem to go back down the path we've already been down before because we believe that good times will continue forever, and they almost never do. And in fact, it's really interesting to think about now because we're on a pretty significant, certainly in the US, a pretty significant bull market where there's been significant stock market gains without much of a pullback for many years now. And one thing we know is that ultimately that will end. The problem is it's very difficult to predict when. So that's why it's important, getting back to the theme of this presentation, to be looking at data and to be using experiments to determine what you're going to do given that there is that uncertainty.
Thank you very much. And another interesting question. Big data is a big buzzword these days. In your view, what are some of the major challenges organizations going to encounter by relying heavily on this big data strategy?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. I think there are two challenges. One is having the resources to actually go through the data. And I see this, frankly, in my own organization at HBX. You know, we've had about 23,000 people, which isn't huge by big data standards, but certainly enough to have some interesting data. We've had 23,000 students go through one of our online programs, and we have a lot of information about how they interacted with our platform, how certain elements that are used to teach them things work and don't work. The problem is we are engrossed in the daily kind of running of our business, finding the time and resources to go back and look at all the data we've gathered and organize it and find out what it's telling us about our student behavior is the hard part. We just are too busy trying to keep the train running and not spending enough time seeing what's happened as we've been running the train, if you will. So, but if you solve that problem and you do have people that are able to analyze the data, I think the big risk is kind of a variation on this normalization of deviancy. It's relying too much on the numbers that you dive in and you start to find some very narrow trend and think that, as an example, and think that trend is a truth that exists in a bigger way. So it's really important to make sure you really understand cause and effect and don't make decisions based on a little nugget of information that appears in data but is not that statistically significant. I do also think that, and we've seen this over and over again, there's always this thought that big data, machine learning, technology in general will replace a significant portion of the human piece of business and society. And while I think that's true, it does seem to me that this is something that's been a concern for decades, or centuries maybe even. We always think that technology is going to be the undoing of human interaction. And I believe in some ways that, getting back to this idea of ideas and networks, that technology it allows us to connect in ways that we couldn't before, and in fact can make human interaction even more important. I think that the jury's still out. We don't know for sure. I know there's a debate raging now between some technological icons who have differing opinions about, I know Elon Musk at Tesla and Jeff Bezos at Amazon and others have debated kind of the future of artificial intelligence. But if you lump big data in with that, and I think you'll need big data for any of those things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, I really do think that if done right, it's going to be a great way to connect people better. And I'm not as fatalistic about it being, a terrible thing where the robots are going to take over the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, moving to a question on a rapidly changing environment. If we are not overestimating, do you really believe that very soon robots will be putting humans in people's zoo? That's interesting.
I'm sorry, if we're not overestimating, do I believe humans will put, say that last part again?
Robots will be putting humans in the people's zoo.
Oh, robots putting humans in the people's zoo? I am very, very skeptical of that. Now, I'm not Elon Musk. I am not a futurist or technologist with intimate knowledge of what's going on in the world of robotics and artificial intelligence. But I'm skeptical that will happen. I hope it doesn't happen. And if I do end up in a zoo, I hope I'm in a nice one. But I am skeptical of that. I just, as I said, I think that human beings and their capacity for imagination and for doing things that can both, increase the amount of connectivity between us and doing it in a measured way is something that I think we will see. So I'm not worried about being in a zoo.
All right, thank you very much. Another one from Femi Oy, that's on the cultural side. What do you do as a leader where senior managers in your organization always never take responsibility for the trouble an organization is experiencing, but always believe their employees are probably not good enough? Does culture have something to do with this? It's more of an HR question, but feel free to.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't. I certainly think that the culture of a country can play a huge part of this. It's one thing that I found is, generally speaking, in the United States, I think people are more open than not, certainly compared to many other cultures in the world, when it comes to giving direct feedback while being a manager or a leader. But that said, it's a problem that exists everywhere. And I think the key to that, and it may not be an answer people want to hear, is it's really important to make sure that when you assemble a team, when you hire people to be a part of your team, that you're explicitly looking for that trait. You're looking for the trait that they are going to be somebody who takes responsibility for their own departments. They are going to be people who are going to make sure that if people aren't working out in their group, that they're going to change the people. Now, again, this can be easier said than done depending on the country you're in, because it's a lot easier in the United States to get rid of people from an organization if you feel they're not working out than it is, for example, in much of Western Europe. But when you do have the opportunity to hire, I think it's so important to make sure that those you're hiring are willing to make the tough choices to make sure that they're holding their own people accountable, and that they're also willing to take on their own accountability. The other thing that I think is important is to speak openly about it with your senior team. We have a weekly meeting with those that report to me. And while we don't always say this explicitly, I do think we hold each other accountable. If somebody said that they were going to do something, a month ago and it didn't get done, we all have a relationship where I think we're relatively comfortable saying to that person, hey, you didn't do what you said you were going to do, and it's hurting the team. And it can be done in a way, if you set the expectation from the beginning that that's the way things are going to be, I think you'll be surprised at how people will react to it. I'm not saying it's easy, and it can be painful. It's particularly painful if you don't have the right people and who aren't willing at least to be part of a group where you're going to hold people mutually accountable. But I think you don't know until you try, so it's important to speak explicitly about it. And then, as I said, make sure you're always hiring people that you think will have those traits.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking at the clock, so we're just pressed on time. So I'll take one last question, one from Ms. Hon Landry. The question is, great presentation. I would like your feedback on how culture can quickly change in a very large organization. If culture in this scenario represents the Titanic and would be similar to trying to turn the Titanic quickly.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting point. Again, the answer might be unsatisfying. I'm not sure it's easy to do it very quickly, and obviously quickly is a relative term. It starts at the top, though. I think you have to have a leader at the top who is very clear about what the culture needs to be, and that they have a line of managers working for them who all are bought into that strategy of culture change. Is that I've been in organizations where there are people who are not, quote unquote, on the bus and are fighting the culture change. And at the risk of sounding overly dramatic, those people can be poison to an organization. So it's really, really important that everybody is singing from the same sheet of music, as we say, and that they are all making sure that they're saying the same thing at the same time to everybody in the organization. So there's a consistency in message about the culture. I think, though, that even if you do that, the analogy is exactly right. It is like turning the Titanic. It does not happen overnight, and it's completely a function of how large the organization is. If I've been in an organization, I ran one many years ago that had about 20 people in it, and it was really kind of messed up. And it was a bit of a turnaround operation, and we were pretty successful at the turnaround. And it took about a year for 20 people to get there. And by the way, part of the way to solve that problem was some of those 20 people were let go because they didn't get on board with what the new culture was going to be. If you're in an organization that's 200, I think it takes about twice as long. So the larger the organization gets, the more time you're going to need to do it. And I do think, too, the larger the organization is, the harder it is to make a dramatic pivot right away. So I think it's important for leaders to pick the one or two most important things they want to change, get those done, and then worry about others as you have success, because you build credibility with your employees who hopefully will see the benefits of the changing culture based on those one or two levers, and will then get behind you when you're looking to change more things. It's not easy, though.
Yes, and that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. So any quick concluding remarks that you would like to give, Mr. Mullane, before we dismiss out?
No, I really appreciate the time. I'm very passionate about these sorts of things, and it's fun to try and live them in my own organizations. I'm certainly not perfect about it, as those that work for me will say. It's a continuing journey, and I think it's important for those listening here and others who are in leadership or management positions to really, and the fact that you're on a webinar like this shows that you are interested in doing these things, but to really keep educating yourself on ways to improve the way you lead and execute. And if you keep doing that, then good things will happen. thanks very much for the opportunity, Mr. Jaffrey. Appreciate it.
Thank you indeed, and I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for taking the time to deliver this live and quite an interactive webinar through this platform. So once again, thank you very much, Mr. Patrick Mullane, for your time. And
thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. Please be informed that those who have successfully attended, you're eligible to claim 1 PTCs for recertification of the credit hours from the SHRM. And for that, you can always write back to me at ali@mile.org. You will be receiving an email on it. And equally, if you would like to receive an online certificate of attendance for this webinar, please come back to us, and we'll be happy to send the certificate based on the eligibility criteria. So thank you very much, all of those who attended this webinar. With that note, I would like to end and conclude. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.